Hi Newton, it's Nick here, and we're going to do an assessment of this survey. So the reason I'm doing it is because there's quite a lot to get through, and uh, we're here to help you, and this is a way of doing it. So the good thing about this property is that it's a fundamentally good property, i.e., it was originally built, I think, probably around 1890, 1900, that kind of time. The quality of the brickwork is reasonably good. The roof is decent and it's had damp-proof repairs, which is also very good. And other little details like this brick inlay here, for example, and the stone lintels just demonstrates that it's a reasonably well-built building. Some of them aren't, and we try and filter out the junk, as it were, early on. And anyway, this one we liked, and I like. Um, so, also just to give you some context on this, I used to have a renovation business back in the 90s, early 2000s, before I got into other stuff like the internet and so on. And I've done since 2000, since I got out of the renovations game. We used to do properties in Chelsea, which is a place in London, and thereafter I've done three big renovations and a big new build. So, i.e., the house we live in now. So I've been around. And what can I tell you about this? So anyway, yeah. Not to say that I know everything because I don't. Joe is more knowledgeable than me, but our builder. But anyway, let's get into it. So we've got the survey and the guys saying stuff. Now, what I've done is gone through this earlier just to save time later and highlighted everything as you see that is of interest to me. So he is saying that essentially the property is reasonable. It was a reasonable purchase, and there are some issues which we're going to talk about. And he reckons that it's resaleable in normal conditions, and I agree. That's why we suggested you have a look at this thing. And he thinks it's a reasonable purchase at £110,000. So that's all good. Now, the thing you'll find about these survey reports is there's an awful lot of extra wordage in this, and it's either extra it's explanation into things, or it's just general narrative, and a lot of it is also avoidance of liability. So he'll be saying things like he couldn't inspect certain things and etc. And there's no liability if if whatever. So it's just typical surveyor stuff. All right, now he talks about a lot of things need urgent uh, attention. Now most of these things don't need urgent attention in my view, and we'll talk about that in a minute. To excuse my drinking soup. Um, it's Saturday evening, and I just wanted to get all this done. Anyway, the property. He reckons around 1900s, and you can kind of tell by the style of the property. And the weird thing about property, I've got to say, is how you can tell the period of the property by its style and how different eras have different styles. And it's just weird how that happens like that. Sorry, I'm just kind of pontificating a little bit. Anyway, right. Good thing. It's got an EPC-C. That's good. That's very good for a terraced house. It's rare. And that's just generally good news for resale, for the future, for future-proofing the property and so on. It's all good. So anyway, some general stuff here. Okay, so he talks about no off and on-road parking, but actually we've got street parking here, and that looks just good. It's fine. There's plenty of it. And I remember looking at this and seeing there was plenty of parking around, so I figured parking is no issue. And then it's very quiet, yes, and of course we would have done the crime assessment and that would have come out low crime, of course, and local amenities and so on. So he's talking about some flood risk. So there's really broadly there are kind of three types of flood risk, I suppose. Flood from the sea, not going to happen here. Flood from rivers, that's not happening here. And then you have surface water flooding, which is essentially just if you have a torrential downpour, then you have a risk of flooding on the street and so on. But this isn't a serious issue at all in reality. And the reason I say that is because if you look at let's go to the top. Right. If you look at the front door, you can't see it, but basically the front door is raised, and you'd have to have a torrential flood for the property to be actually flooded. So essentially there is more or less a non-existent risk of flooding in the property due to surface flooding. All right, so moving on. Yeah, you can see, so you've got this. I'd like to let me just find another picture of this, because I just want to find a picture where you can actually see the property, see the front door, and we can see how high up it is. Okay, here we go. Yeah, so you've got a slope running down here. And also, interestingly, the gutter runs out here. So the rainfall gutter runs here and straight onto the pavement. But there's a camber on this, and you've also got a downhill camber. If you look very carefully, you can see a little slope here. So flooding, I'm not concerned about that. Next, he talks about radion and other threats. There aren't any. It is in a coal mining risk area, but we did a check for that, and there wasn't any issue. And generally speaking, the way it works is that if you have a coal mining entrance, then within 20 meters of the property, then that could be a problem. And so a lot of the one thing you'll find is in a lot of these areas, the green spaces are where the old mine shafts are being covered up, and then the old buildings, they wouldn't have built on it. So anyway, it's got a very low risk around coal mining subsidence, which is good. It's not a conservation area. That's also good. Now, what that means is that there would be certain restrictions to adapting the house or whatever in a conservation area. In other words, they want to conserve the look of the area. And it's also worth pointing out that this has cobblestones in front, which is quite rare and makes it really quite charming, in my opinion. And so that's a nice feature. All right, moving on. There's no chimney stack on this property, and arguably that's a good thing, because people don't really have open fires these days. They'll have gas central heating or electrical heating or electricity powered heating. But so it's just one less thing to have to deal with. Now the reason they would have taken out the chimney was just to make things simpler. So the roof was replaced probably 40 years ago. And in doing that, they also just removed the chimney stack. So they talk about vent tiles, and we mentioned this, and this is a good thing, or I may have mentioned it. Vent tiles are simply little tiles, the plastic things that are slotted into the roof. And what they do is they help ventilate the roof space, which is important because if the roof space is damp, then the timbers get damp. They can then start to grow fungus and weaken, and then you've got a collapsing roof. But there's none of that. It's all in really good condition, which is good. It's what I like to see. And then he talks about the downpipe running onto the public pavement. I don't buy into this whole thing about the payment near. Yeah, that's not an easy job um, to do, to change everything and redirect it down some ground gully. Um, you'd have to get the local authority to do that and so on. So it's a non for me. It's a non-issue um, because the property has had damp proofing, extensive damp proofing, and it doesn't show signs of damp. So what's the point? Okay, and then he talks about gutters being blocked easily, etc. So that's a threat, but honestly, it's not a made. It's not a. In this context, it's okay. And then we have UPV sound downpipes, so that's all fine. He's just commenting on the gutters and so on. And I'll just zoom in here a little bit. Yeah, as I said, there's a little bit of moss growing into some of the between the bricks and such. Now, arguably, you could repoint some of this, and it might be worth doing. But the bricks are actually in good condition, and they're not spalding. Spalding is where moisture gets into the brick, and then with a freeze-thaw cycle, the, basically the brick starts to break up. And when you have that, it's really important to do the pointing. And in this case, you're not getting that, so I don't think that's really an issue. It probably just needs a bit of a scrub and get the moss off, and just make sure the walls are basically tidy. And then we've got a nice cavity wall. This is really good. As you know, the way cavity walls work, if he's got a diagram, essentially it's an outer wall and an inner wall, and there's an air gap in the middle, and that's acts as an insulation. And um, before in the old days, there was just an air gap, and that was your insulation. And then over time, as building regulations got tighter, the requirements for insulation improved. So what's happened here is that the walls have had insulation injected into them, which is great. And this is why it gets such a good EPC rating, by the way, because it's got it's got uh, foam or beads injected into it, which obviously make it more thermally efficient. So it's going to be a nice, dry, warm house, which is very good. And here we go here, vegetation, yep. And this isn't so good. But then it's a minor issue. It's probably, once renovating, it's probably worth just doing a bit of pointing and filling up some of these gaps and just tidying up some of the brickwork. It's quite a quick and straightforward job to do, and I think it's probably worth doing. And then you've got the air brick, and then you've got injected DPC. So let's have a look. I'm not quite clear on where air brick injected, so I don't quite know where the damp proof course has been injected, but there are, I mean, it would be here above the black brick, but usually you see drill holes, and I know there are drill holes in another of the picture. Oh yeah, here we are. So if you can see those little marks there, those little round marks, they're the drill holes for the damp proof. And the way that works is they drill a hole, obviously, and then they inject a very viscous liquid, which then expands into the brick and then makes the brick impervious to moisture, and therefore it becomes a damp-proof course. So it's good. It's what we like to see. So this is a nice little economy house, like a low-cost house, that's in fundamentally good condition. And here we go here. You can see DPC to the front. This is all really good. It's just one of those hassly £5,000 or £6,000 jobs where you get issues with oh yeah, here's the cavity wall insulation. You can see they spray some stuff into the wall, and they remove a brick, spray some stuff in, and then fill in the brick, and then off they go. So it's great. All of these kind of hassly um, critical tasks that make a house nice, warm and warm and dry have been done. And the windows are all in reasonably good condition. So failed unit means you get condensation between the two panes of glass on so here we are here. So what happens sometimes is that you get a failure in the seal, and then air comes in, and then you get condensation building up, and it's just annoying, and they should be replaced. Now, he says no safety marks, etc. Now, what I think has happened, as I said, I think these are quite old double glazing units. I don't know whether it's 1970s or not, possibly a little later. But anyway, he talks about no safety marks, but that's basically just where it says it's safety glass. It's not important at all. Okay, so a lock has failed in the back. That's not so good. This is probably the original double glazing. Well, certainly the brown. So this is probably, so they're using white plaster UPVC double glazing at the back, and then at the front they're using this nicer looking brown front facaded double glazing to presumably make it look nicer on street view. Okay, so he talks about the front door being of composite, so it's basically one of these plastic doors, and he's just saying that there should be a kite mark or British standard mark. The thing is, he says it's non-compliant, but the reality is that if you were putting the door in today, yes, it would be non-compliant. But the way building regulations work is that it's not retrospective. So if those doors were put in 20 years ago, when that wasn't a requirement, then that's it. It's not a problem. The only time you have issues like with building regulations is if you have something that's absolutely safety critical, like something like some sort of dangerous wiring or some bad piping or something like that, which could kill. Then that's a different story. But this kind of stuff is not really a problem. It's just like it's something that's inherited. And if we move on to the roof, and this is something I like, and it's all in fair condition, which I'm really pleased about. Right, so there was a couple of rafters. Okay, but that's not really a huge issue. The main thing he's saying, there are no issues with the actual structure of the roof. And then he says there was roof felt, and this is important because more modern roofs have roof felt or some kind of membrane underneath. The trouble with felt is it's not breathable, and more modern properties have a breathable membrane which goes under the roof. So what am I talking about? I'll show you here. And it really this felt acts as a kind of secondary barrier. So if the slate comes off and there's a hole in the roof, the water's not going to come straight in. It actually just hits the bitumen and just rolls out, and that's that. So it's a good thing, and to have this. And so anyway, that's what he's talking about there. And then we've got the insulation. He's saying some areas of insulation need to be a bit thicker. Okay, it's a cheap thing to sort out, and it's a reasonably sensible thing to do as well. And then he talks about the ventilation. Yes, the vent soffits, that's all good. We saw those earlier. So that's all fine. Then he talks about the party wall, and he doesn't know if the ceiling joists are strong enough to take all the stored stuff. So there's quite a lot of, well, you'll see in a minute, pictures of stored junk, basically. This party wall looks like it's in reasonably good condition. So this is the wall that separates this house from the next house. And there are gaps, he says, but, you know, it's not really much of an issue. it secures the property from the property next door, which is a good thing. Anyway, so yes, okay, there are some gaps, and this is an issue, but really, in reality, it's not. It's not much of an issue at all. And there's a loads of junk. So the issue is, by the way, it's to do with fire safety. So the thinking is that if you have a fire next door and it's totally blocked off, then that blocks the fire from kind of creeping across. But because this is an old party wall, um, from my experience with other properties that we've been dealing with, we've had one where there was no party wall. And yes, it's annoying and it's kind of a problem, but it's not necessarily a legal requirement to have one if you're letting the property out. And so this isn't an issue, basically. That's what I see. And he's got all this junk up there. Fine. And now he talks about a mixture of plaster and lath and plasterboard. So I'll just explain what plaster and lath is, because I think it's worth just getting into that. And this is plaster and lath. So I'll get a picture. Here's something here. And so it's strips of wood, and then the plaster is splodged on top, and it kind of curls back like this, and that acts as a fixing onto it acts as a fixing for the plaster, and you get whole walls of it like that, and so on. And the problem with it is that it's quite an inconsistent surface, so you get undulations and so on. And also, as the plaster gets very old, these snots, I think they're called, they get brittle, and the whole lot is at risk, or can be at risk of just falling off, which isn't great. But anyway, lots of textured coating, something you see in so many properties in the north of England. Now, wherever a room has modern coving, it generally tells me that it was renovated. So the reason being, bear with me whilst I finish this. Sorry, Newton. Right. The reason being that original plasterwork was very different to this type of coving here. So this is just simple. You buy it in a store and you cut it to size and plonk it in. But the original coving that would have been on it in 1890 was actually quite difficult to put on. It was solid plaster and it was just a lot more fiddly. So whenever I see this kind of stuff, I think, okay, they've stripped out the original ceiling, therefore it's probably plasterboard, which is a good thing. And uh, and so I think most of this is plasterboard, which is good. So here you got, in this room, you've got this coving here. It's quite difficult to really judge this, but I would say this is plasterboard. I would say. I mean, I can't guarantee it, but I would imagine it is, just because this coving is more modern. And you got some undulations and stuff like that on the ceiling. Then in the kitchen, I'll just zoom that back out. So in the kitchen, he says there's plaster and lath. Now, maybe. It depends how extensive it, the coving. I don't know. I would be surprised if it was plaster and lath throughout. There may be some sections of plaster and lath, but I think on the whole it's probably plasterboard. And the reason I think that is because this was thoroughly renovated and everything was stripped out. So why would you save one little section of ceiling when you could just rip it out and do it right? So that's why I'm not sure about that. Now, the other thing, some hairline cracks, that's fine. Textured ceilings, yuck, but fine. And here he talks about the laths. I'm not convinced about that, but in any event, I don't think it's much of an issue. No structural, that's all good. Walls are upright and elevated. We're going to get into this elevated moisture reading thing in a minute. So this could be an issue. but so it's the front wall of the front bedroom. So let's just have a look here and talk about this. So front wall, front bedroom up here somewhere. That's a gutter problem. So you can see here, in fact, if you look closely, there was a repair here. So my guess is that, we'll have a look at the survey, but my guess is there was a leak in the gutter and it was just draining down here and the water just kind of worked its way through. So let's just have a look here. Where is the leak? And if it is there, so front wall to the left. So that would be, so it's the left on this side. If I'm looking at it from the road, am I looking at it from the left or the right? I can't really work this out. So if I look at there, so it's on the, I think it would be the opposite, wouldn't it? So in other words, if I'm looking at it from the other side, and that would be to the right. Okay, so then is the broken gutter to the right? Yes, it is. It's to the right. So that's your problem. Fine. So it's just a case of getting up there, sorting that gutter out properly. End of damp problem. Okay, these moisture readings are fine, I think. It's difficult to see from this. But the way this works is you've got two prongs, it sticks into the wall, and I think there is elevated moisture reading here. Where is that? I don't know where that is. That could be an issue, but I'm not too concerned about it. If we see, we'll see more pictures of the, yeah, here we go. So the way that works is you've got two prongs, you stick it in the wall, it checks the moisture reading between the two prongs. If it's in the middle, it's okay. If it's down the bottom, that's good. If it's right at the top, that's bad. Bad as in a lot of moisture. And generally the moisture readings are okay. And it's difficult, yeah, it's okay here. So it may be defective plaster, but it's not damp plaster. So I think the damp problem is to do with the gutter being broken. So that's fine. Now we're on to rear bedroom wall indentations. I think what he's saying is there's a hole in the plaster. Okay, it just needs filling in. And what have we got? Kitchen rear wall. It looks like it's around there, so I think it's neutral, so that's okay too. And down here, front wall to the lounge. Now, one of the important things to note is that when the damp proofing is, when they do tests for damp proofing, they usually pick a spot that's quite low. And the reason for that is when you have a house that isn't heated or is heated, heat rises, and therefore these areas here, they're quite low down and they're cooler, and therefore the heat doesn't do its thing and the moisture doesn't evaporate so easily, so therefore this is where you get damp. But there isn't any, so that's good. And on to the next thing, laminate, etc., etc. And there was an undulation here. You can see there was a bit of a warp in the flooring. My guess is that, well, I don't know, you would only know if you could go in there and just jump up and down on that and see if it moved. My guess is that the flooring wasn't done quite right and it kind of compressed. And when it compresses, you can get this undulation, possibly. Or there isn't really a good reason why it's undulating other than it's undulating. But he's not too bothered about it, nor am I. Okay, what's next? Dry and the old chimney breast, i.e. that's where the fire was when there was a kitchen, a chimney, what am I saying? Thinking about kitchens. And anyway, so nothing much to say there. And he's talking about the kitchen, which is in reasonably good condition. Gas hob, nice, like a gas hob, good for cooking. And you got a sink and so on. So door panels, he just says we're okay. Redecoration is removed. Fine, whatever. They chose to have timber, like this fine. Next thing, handrail. Right, now this is an important point. So it says that the handrails should be continuous, etc., etc. So the big one here is the 100 mil sphere. So what this is all to do with, if there's a picture, here we are. And this is why I think it's 1970s, by the way, because in the 1970s, building regulations allowed for staircases like this with the big gap. Then subsequently, they changed the regulations so that effectively 100 millimeters sphere, as in that size, is a baby's head size. So the idea is that you've got to have a gap no larger than 100 millimeters. You can't have a bigger gap, and you got a bigger gap here, and this is probably something worth sorting out if as a landlord renting it out and so on. I think it is worth dealing with this and closing it up. So how would you do that? Well, very simple. You just get an extra plank in there and paint it white so that there's no gap greater than 100 millimeters at any point along here. And then the little toddler who's messing around up here can't climb through and fall and break their head open. So that's what that's about. So I think it's just it's a low cost thing to do, and I think it's a sensible thing. You can see it here. So just fill in the gap. And I think this is probably less than 100 millimeters. That you wouldn't get a 100 millimeter sphere through here, but you definitely would here. All right. So overall, I think this property is well looked after. Oh yeah, another point he's making is that the staircase is possibly a little too steep. So modern building regulations say that a staircase has to be 45 degrees or less. But again, as I pointed out earlier, with building regulations, they're not retrospective. So they're not going to go and say, well, you have to change the camber of the stairs because it doesn't meet modern building regulations. It was built 120 years ago. You're fine. It doesn't, there's no implication here. It's just a reasonably steep stairs. That's it. So anyway, bathroom fittings, yeah, that's all fine. It's a bit of an economy. Well, I say that it's a relatively modern bathroom suite, and I would say it's probably about 10 years old. So my guess is that some of the really big renovations were done in the 70s, and then more recently things like kitchen and bathroom have been updated. A nice bathroom radiator. And you can tell that by the faucets and stuff. So they put a little bit of money into that and made it nice. And it's nice to see that they've got a mixer here, and it's not off a power shower thing. It's off the central heating, which comes off a combination boiler. So that's another good thing. There are lots of nice, straightforward things here. Now he gives this a 3, a warning. Why? Because he doesn't have a certificate for it. But it all looks fine to me. Now, I'm not an expert in this kind of thing. Joe would know more than me about this, but this looks like good fuse board, and I think it looks like it's in good condition. So that's good. And we've got the gas meter here. That's good. And then he kind of carries on. Combination boiler, great. And radiators, great. There's the combi boiler. And that was obviously quite modern. So you probably find if you have a look around, there's probably, I would imagine it's less than 10 years old. So that's another good thing. Like I say, there's lots of good things about this house. And what else is he saying? Drainage, okay, that's fine. So this needs a bit of a tidy up around here, a bit of jet washing, I would say, a good clean up, and it'll come up nicely. And then he just talks about the backyard. As I said, jet wash this thing, jet wash some of the back wall, bring it up. Look at that. Give it a jet wash. It'll come up nice. And then it'll just present better when letting out. Okay, so broadly, this property doesn't need much work. I would say the gutter needs to be checked and made sure it's good. A little bit of painting and decorating internally. It's 661 square meters. That's a reasonable size. It's not a big house, but it's in reasonable condition, so that's good. And overall, I think we're more or less there. Talks about the valuation. Valuation's okay. And finally, here we go, diagrams and other stuff, and that's it. So let's just go to the full screen. Here we go. Aha, you got me in full size now. All right. The survey's good, I think, on the whole. It's a reasonably tidy property. It probably needs about I would say £1,500 worth of tight fixing and cleaning. So deep clean, uh, fix, maybe do some of the pointing, make sure that gutter is done correctly, fix that damp issue in the front bedroom, redo that and just make sure it's all tidy and clean and doing it, appropriate. And give everything a jet wash out the backyard so it presents better. And then I think you got yourself a really nice little renter. All right. Thank you very much.